Hey watercolor fans, I have a great little tutorial for you today. We're going to be working on this interior scene of a glass bottle sitting on a table. It's got dramatic lighting. I've chosen this scene mainly because we're going to be working with symmetry and surface reflections on a glass surface and a translucent quality to the glass that allows light to pass through, and we'll be seeing a reflection on the inside of the bottle as well. Should be a fun project to get started on, and we'll get started sketching this up. And again, I'm going to be eyeballing and drawing this from observation using that photograph as reference. So I'm going to block out, I'm going to block out a box on my page, and then I'm going to go after and get all the proportions, hopefully somewhat correct, or at least believable. I'm drawing in the window, and we'll sketch up the bottle and the tabletop. There's 1 point perspective in this as well, and that tabletop is a good indication of the 1 point perspective. I give this type of an assignment to my students in class all the time, so it's definitely something that they have to work with and figure out how to do, and it's a fun overall assignment that they tend to like. They're oftentimes surprised at how much fun working with simple still lifes can be. Starting out with a basic rough shape of a square, I kind of made it a trapezoid and built the overall structure of the bottle from that square, just getting the angles correct. So I did not use the symmetrical ring process that I've shown in previous videos. In this case, I started out with a square, a rectangle, a trapezoid, and built it from that. You may have noticed as I was drawing, I made a mistake. I had to erase and fix the scale of the bottle in the format of the paper. But the one thing I didn't do is I didn't scale the width. So this little jug that I'm drawing is a little fatter than the photograph. That's all right, we'll make it work. All right, so I'm just gonna work around, try to get all of the detail onto the bottle that I'll need when I start painting with the watercolor. That big highlight shape on the left side of the bottle, that is essentially a distorted reflection of the window that's casting all the light onto the surface. And then on the back side over there on the right, it's just the opposite reverse, and it's distorting because of the shape of the bottle, the surface distortion caused by the bottle. Just working in, finding the highlights, the things I'll need when I start painting. All right, now we're moving into stage 1 color blocking. So I'm going to mix up a range of colors on my little palette here. They're going to be fairly saturated. It's a dark overall piece. The background's a very rich, deep, burnt umber, which will have a lot of different color variations and shade variations. So I'm mixing in greens and burnt siennas, and I'll just kind of work around, block all that big shape color, work around that bottle. Now I'm working around the bottle mainly because it's going to have a lot of those highlights, and I want to protect a lot of them as I get going. So I'm going to just work around it. All the rest of the piece is going to be pretty much in that brown. I'm making marks in the direction of the boards with the watercolor brush on the tabletop, and I've blocked around the window as well, and I'm holding the brush upright even though you can't see it, painting with the edge of that brush, that big wide brush, and just dropping in the shapes of the window sills. All right, now I'm going to add a little more of the density, a little more darkness, a little more contrast into the wet. This is all wet on wet now. Started out with wet on dry, blocking in, getting the paint where I want it. But now that it's still wet, I can drop in other colors that will interact with that wet spot from the first dab of paint. And I am working on this is a Strathmore paper, so it is going to hold the color a lot longer than the Canson. And dropping that darkness in because of the the shading, the lightness, the darkness going on. Just trying to get some color variation, color complexities. It's a semi-dry brush. There's pigment in my brush, but it's not loaded with water, so it's not a extremely wet brush, but I wanted to get some of those directional lines on the tabletop. And there's a couple of little highlighted areas close to the bottle that I just picked out with a damp brush. I'll work in that little hole on the finger hole of the bottle there. And mixing up a nice pool of burnt sienna and some orange, and I'm going to come after the color of the jug, making irregular marks where those highlights might be, those little peekaboos of white paper. And even though the paper's wet, I'm running the color right up to the edge of the burnt sienna and the burnt umber initial color blocking. I'm just building the shape of that bottle. The whole left side has that highlight on it, and the right side is pretty much the color of the glass itself. And that's all you got to do, is just come in and get the initial colors set and painted in position. And now that's wet on dry, because I do want a pretty sharp line where that windowsill happens. And just dropping in little suggestions of color. I can mess with all that later once the color's dry. Again, I think, yeah, I'm working on it. The right side is a bit higher than the left side. So yeah, I don't quite have my symmetry correct. That left side is just a smidge lower. And we are now into stage 2. The piece is dried enough. It's still just a bit damp, and I keep testing it, but it's dry enough I can come in and start working a little bit with the high key colors on the windowsill and get that blocked in a little better. So adding a little tight work right there, just add a little more structure to the windowsill. Little structural work there. Cooler colors. My palette's sliding all over. My drafting table sits at an angle, so gravity is always kind of fighting me with my little travel palette. It's got a smooth back, so it's always a sliding around. The large palette that I'll break out on some of the larger yet to come tutorials, that has it's a porcelain and it's heavy and it doesn't go anywhere. Alright, so working in some contrast now, finding shapes, dropping in the density, feathering edges. That center portion right behind the bottle has a nice brown tint to it, but there's lots of really cool shadows in and around that, and you can see the contrast really pops that burnt sienna on the glass of the bottle. So I'm using, it's wet on dry again, but dropping in big shapes and then feathering it out, letting the water create a nice transition from one color to another. So mixing up some darks, working with my fine tip brush, drawing in the shadow lines on the boards on the surface of the table, and really ignoring the initial strokes I made on the surface and trying to get the 1-point perspective to read correctly. Blocking in the shadow. And the way we're looking at that bottle, the lower portion of that bottle reads as a line. So that means we're pretty much looking at the bottom of the bottle straight on. There's no elliptical shape to it. It's just essentially a straight edge sitting on that tabletop because of our light, or I'm sorry, our point of view. All right, painting in a little of the shadow lines on the structure of the window sill. I had to get up and change angles since I have my paper taped down and it's wet. I had to kind of get up and work at a different angle. And you can see the line work is not perfect. It's got some character. I just need to get it to read just straight enough. It doesn't have to be as straight as though I drew it with a ruler. So I'm just bouncing around, again, getting that contrast in, building structure. Still working to frame out that windowsill a little better, get a little better structure on it. It's still pure white inside the highlights. I haven't done anything there yet. Working on that shadow a little more, destroying that lost edge back there where the table meets the wall. You can't see it. The wall and the tabletop are the same color density, so that line disappears, whereas on the left side of the bottle you can see the edge. And now I'm just picking some highlights. I'm going to work a little texture work. The piece is drying and the surface of the table has been left alone, so it's dry enough. So just a damp brush, come in, reactivate, find some streaks and striations, wood grain to the top of the surface of the boards, picking out those highlight edges where the plane changes from a horizontal to a vertical. Put the brush down, and now I'm going to paint some structure on the bottle. It has dried enough. I'm going to find the dark edge and add the big shapes to the surface of the bottle, the glass surface. I got a good base color of that burnt sienna, and I've got this cool color with burnt umber and some phthalo blue, and it's a dense, rich, deep color. I also noticed that for a tutorial about symmetry, my bottle is not that symmetrical, so we need to work on that. See if I fix it. I think I fix it enough, or I'd have noticed it. Yeah, that little work I just did with the dark on the edge of that helped the symmetry on the left side a little bit. Alright, so bouncing around, finding shapes. When you're painting reflections, it is good to keep your strokes, they're sharp. They tend to be elongated shapes and lines, so you're not looking at a lot of organic shapes. They're very clean and crisp and definitive. They're not that fuzzy either. So I've got a very fine brush, and I'm essentially, with a fairly thick mixture of paint, I'm drawing now. This is where you practice your drawing. If you need to, practice your drawing with dry media. This is where you develop that hand, that ability to make a quick, confident stroke, a mark that has meaning. You're doing it like you mean it. There There's the interior, that's that shape, that thick shape at the bottom of the bottle. Lots of contrast. A deep bluish color. And again, this is fairly thin, and that thin blue allows for the burnt sienna color to shine through. Because remember, your watercolors are translucent, they're transparent. So I'm going to drop in that color and then feather it out here, because there is a transition, a color transition in between the highlights. So we're really dropping in a lot of contrast. A little browner color now. And thin it out, feather it out. And now it's starting to pop. It's always that little, when you start popping in that contrast, everything starts really to pop and read really completed. So I covered up a lot of that burnt sienna with that contrast, except for that back highlight, and I'm still feathering out, trying to get that nice transition from the interior reflected light to the exterior surface of the bottle. And that's got to dry. It needs a sharper edge, but it's got to dry. I wanted that transition, feathered it out, and just leaving it alone and working somewhere else now. So bottle's all wet, so I need to come over and I can work a little more on the surface of the boards. Get some cross contour marks and highlights. I'm just picking color again, just lifting it off of the paper. Creating the wood grain, the striations. Fixing that little blurb of color that came out of the bottle. Here we go. Lifting, softening, adding definition, and letting it dry. Testing, seeing where it was dry. Alright, so now the piece is dried again. So we're now going to start bouncing around, working in all sorts of detail, structure, contrast. We're just going to bounce around. This is the end portion of the project where all the magic starts to happen. We're going to add all the little pops and edges, spots of highlights, dry brush. We'll be adding some textures in, not only on the boards, but on the wall. And we still have to address those big white areas where the window is on the left, and then the highlight on the bottle needs some color as well, so it's not just pure paper. And with all of the pieces, for me, this is the part where I'm bouncing around, adding in the details, textures, refining edges, finding highlights, and seems to be the longest portion of the piece as you're refining and finding those edges. I worked on the cork up there, added a little structure, trying to get the densities just right. And I've sped up the action just a little bit. as I'm working through adding the saturated colors, thicker colors. This is definitely a point where you're working with a small brush. I added the cool colors into the highlights on the bottle and on the window to the left as well. I got a great looking little color bloom from the dark color on the edge of the highlight on the bottle. It bloomed right into the window. I kind of liked it. I left it. It's not in the original photograph, but I just kind of liked the way that interacted with that edge. It gave it kind of a nice soft feeling to it. All right, now I'm mixing up a range of warm colors and layering in some textures, some dry brush, getting a little more color complexity to the boards. I'll switch up colors. My color palette keeps sliding around. Put a little color on those highlight areas on the window. Intensifying the shade. Here's a little dry brush there. Some shadow modulation. Put some splatters into the background just for textures. And I notice if I am painting a lot, I've mentioned this before about getting into the zone. And it does help. If you paint a lot, you're going to start taking more risks. You're feeling more confident. You're feeling more comfortable with what you're doing. And you'll try things. And you'll start discovering various things that you can do at various points. Working with those layers, layering a texture on top of something, coming back and removing it. So I just grabbed my Pro White. I'm going to start bouncing around and adding and returning some of the highlights where I want them, where I may have lost them on the bottle, like along the edge of that little ring. They just need a couple points of highlight. And we are closing in on the back end of this watercolor. I need to stop, probably overworking it. I'm fussing around too much with it. Just adding all sorts of little specks and details. The final remaining drops that I think at this point I just need to quit. Add a little tone to that cork up there. A little more detail on the wood grain. And as you do work more and more with watercolor, you'll loosen up. Those details won't be quite as important as you get better at it and as you become more comfortable with your skills. Right now I'm still trying to develop good watercolor skills while recording myself painting, which it is a little bit like walking and chewing bubble gum at the same time. And I am needing to develop my skills and get a little faster without all the detail. A little more splatters there. And as this tutorial is coming to a close, I hope you did learn something. Try these techniques out. This is a great subject matter to work with. Find some images of various glass bottles. I have one with refractions that we're going to be working with. That should be a pretty good challenge as well. Here is our final piece in all of its overworked glory. It turned out pretty well for still not being quite as symmetrical as it should be. It turned out. It reads. Anyway, if you got any value out of this tutorial, please give me a like and a subscribe. I appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.